I'm here again with Rietje Keys. Today's date is June 11th, 2024, and Rietje is going to discuss the mobilization of Holland, 1939.
Right. This is what is it, our third session?
Third session.
Yeah, Mary is just fantastic to do all this and get me in the picture, so to speak. And there's another friend who is good in video
Production.
video everything, and he is a great help, and he's sitting here correcting if we need to correct something. So I hope it goes all well. I really wanted to talk about the mobilization because it was historically a really a year of waiting for the Germans, what they were going to do. Hitler had invaded Poland in '39, and of course that was a huge endeavor and a big shock to all the Europeans. And then he got his claws on Czechoslovakia also. So all the Western European countries were very, very disbelieving, and they thought, Hitler's, a big screamer, and he doesn't go that far. But he did. He was evil, and he had his eye on all of Europe and on England. And that was not realized, and especially people in Holland said, during the First World War, we were neutral, and the Germans didn't, make it difficult for us at all. So why now? And we're a land of milk and honey, and the economy is pretty good after the Depression. So he will leave us alone because he probably needs us. The export of all the cream and the cheese and the butter and so on, not realizing that Hitler, of course, once he had attacked us, just took it, and it was for nothing that time. In any case, the what I call the living room politics were going on, and I remember as a child that people talked about nothing but that because it was all so uncertain until the military in Holland all of a sudden woke up and said, yes, we have to mobilize, and we have to call all our troops up to reserves and all the young men who want to serve. And I'm not sure if people at a certain age, young men, if they had to join the army or if it was voluntary. I really can't remember that. In any case, everything changed. There was just a fever ran through the whole country, and all the males were in uniform, old or young. My dad by that time was in his early 40s, rather corpulent, didn't look so good in a uniform, but he was a militarist. He loved uniforms and his boots and his horse and so on. So he was in his glory, and he had enough people to continue his business, his accountant's office, and so he played the soldier up to the limit. He became the adjutant of a full colonel, and which was an important job because the colonel was a career military officer, and the army in Holland, before the war was really nothing. And the man went by the book and was what I call a hesitator. And my dad was pretty wide awake, so he was a good one to be with that man. So my dad left home and he went to a little resort town called Noordwijk, where he lived in a pension with other military men, and they formed kind of a headquarter there, and then a life began that is just unbelievable. There was one party after another. There were big balls, and my two oldest sisters dressed up like Russian Tsarinas, and it's unbelievable what went on. And I think it was a kind of in retrospect, a death dance before the evil started. I can't see it any other way. And it also was the end of an era where the wealthy or the very wealthy and the wealthier people and the people like my parents, who in Holland they would say they were not rich, but they warmly comfortable. My mother had 2 maids. It was normal. Other people had maids. My dad had never had a lack of employees in his office. And all that changed. This was the last year that was going on. And when my parents had people over at night for, coffee, drinks, and so on, people came in what we called in long. Ladies in evening dresses and men in what they then called smoking. And, black and with a little bow tie, just really, really all rather official. And once it started going, music, dancing, good food, it was just one party after another. And in the meantime, across from our house, there was a place where the Catholic Church, which was close to us, had meetings and youth groups and so on. That was requisitions for the army. And in moved 5 young cadets. And cadets are not officers yet. They just came freshly out of the only military academy Holland has. And they were ready to be promoted to 2nd lieutenant. They lived there, and all 5 of them, because they were going to be officers, had a footman who polished their boots, who pressed their uniforms, washed their laundry. Again, another world from what it is now and what it was after the war. In any case, we as young children thought those cadets were just fantastic. They were heroes, beautiful uniforms, beautiful manners, good looking, nice to us. And I had my sister Will, who was beautiful, was 20 then. And she was a horseback rider, and so was one of the cadets who was in the artillery. And the artillery then, the cannons or the cannon were still pulled by horses. So this whole group came with a bunch of horses, and they had to be they had to be in a room somewhere to overnight, you couldn't let them go loose. And a bulb farmer across the street from us said, "Oh, I have a shack, and you can park the horses there." And that was okay for the time being. And this one officer, his name was Teun, which is unpronounceable for English-speaking people, but he was just beautiful on a horse. So was my sister. My sister was really beautifully well-built, well-built, and rode a horse very well, and the two attracted each other. And so he would come and court her and ask my parents during the day if it was all right if he could come over in the evening. And he would have a black uniform with a cape, and when he walked to the house he would always smoke a cigarette. Very impolite to enter a Dutch house with a smoking cigarette. So he would ring the bell, throw his cigarette in the gravel next to the front door, and we were waiting. My Hans, Walt, and I were waiting for that moment, because we would take the cigarette and smoke it. But we absolutely adored Teun, because he was beautifully mannered. He was wonderful. And when we got to know him better, he loved me as a little girl, and he would put me on his lap. And I remember sitting there with my ear against his chest, and then hear what's called the timbre of his, what is the English word for timbre? The rumble of a male voice. I can still hear that.
And you were, what, age 7?
I was 7 then. And so he came as often as he could, and he always picked me up, and I always sat there and sucking my thumb, nicely, ear against his chest, hearing what was going on, looking, sucking my thumb, and he would always very gently take my thumb out of my mouth and say, "You're too big for that." And of course, 2 minutes later, come back in, nicely listening. And I remember that as a very warm and just great to be that cherished and held, and it was great. And I certainly was loved at home, but with 10 children and my parents being so busy, there is little time for a child to really sit and relax and hold that child. So what turned it was just filling a gap for me. And I knew that he really liked me. So after dinner, and we were fed very well, Hans, Walter, and I would run across the street to where the cadets were, and they always had some bread in the room. It was army bread and butter, and I can't explain it. They call it an apple. It's not an apple butter. It's much more viscous and solid, but it actually looks like an ointment that they used to put on a wagon, to smear, to make it go round. And that stuff was so good. And they would make a big slice of the bread with thick butter and thick, what was called apple stroop, an apple spread. And we had just eaten, and I don't know how we could eat that bread with that stuff, because we must have been, up till here. But that was so special and so good. And they liked us, and they had little word games with us. And then we were brought up, you never called as a child people later who were older than you by their first name. And there is also in the Dutch language, here it is simply you for everybody. And it used to be that thou, you know, a sign of respect than someone who was a little bit, you know, older. And we had to address all the cadets as thou. And so one day they said, no, you don't have to do that anymore. You can say you, but you have to guess what our first names are. So we all guessed, and I guessed Teun's name because I had just started first grade, and in Dutch school they have a little wooden plank almost with names and words that are good for children when you start to read. And one was an old man with a beard, and his name was Teun. So this was fresh in my mind, and I looked at Teun and I said, your name is Teun. And I was right. And I was very proud, you know, finally. Youngest dumb girl, I had guessed the favorite's name. And so from that time, we could call him Uncle. I could call him Uncle Teun. And then later, when Will and Teun were engaged, we got permission to call Teun Teun, not Uncle Teun anymore. And it took me months to not say, oh, Teun. Well, in any case, the mobilization went on and all the parties, and at one time my parents rented a house in the Heatherfield on the east of the country because my dad was temporarily there for training. What kind of training? I don't know, but he was there, and it was wonderful for us because it was something very different. We had never done that. And again, the whole military environment, uniforms all over the place. My dad strutting, you know, really in his element. And it was a time that is just I don't know how to describe it. It was just a mad rush, I think, and all the talk, and the main sentence was also, they won't attack us, they won't attack us. The Germans are all right, they are our friends, they won't attack us. In the meantime, Chamberlain had the meeting with Hitler, which was a debacle. Hitler just, you know, put what the Dutch call, you put syrup around someone's mouth, you know, sweet words will come out. And Chamberlain came back to England and said, oh, you know, Germany won't attack us. No, Herr Hitler, he called Hitler, Herr Hitler is fine. Nothing will happen. Well, on the 10th of May in 1940, at 4 in the morning, I was awakened by my older sister, Katie, and she said, you better get up. And there was such noise. I'd never heard any noise like that. And I went outside, and the sky was almost black with airplanes. The Germans were invading us, and about 12 kilometers to the west, to the coast, was a little military airport, and that's where my dad experienced the war. The colonel who was in charge was crying, and he said, oh, this is not according to the book. They shouldn't fall out of the sky, because they had all kinds of parachutists who came down on the airport, near the airport. And so it was, for the Germans, a piece of cake, because the Dutch army had pockets of resistance, but cannons were old, everything was old. It was no contest, really. So I cannot tell you the fear. They had airplanes. One airplane was called a Stuka, and it would fly, and then in its dive a kind of a siren went off, and it was a horrible sound, and then it would go up high and go down again, and that sound, and bombs were flying, parachutists were around. It was total chaos. And where do you go when you live in a normal house? Our neighbor had a cellar, and we all crawled in a cellar. A mother, 9 children, and the 2 neighbors. It was a cellar with a window this big. If the house had been bombed, we couldn't get out of the cellar because the window was too small, and we would have suffocated. And my mother made me sit in front of her, between her legs, so she held me close. And then when the Stuka made his dive bombing action, she put her fingers in my ear, and I thought it was a worse pain than the whole war. I wish she wouldn't have done that. And I asked her, no, don't put your fingers in my ear. Oh, she said, but that sound is so awful. You do, weird things. I don't know what I would have done with my child. And so we sat in the cellar for a whole day and a whole night, that first day of the war. And all kinds of rumors, of course, went all over the place. And Dutch soldiers had, at some parts, you had to go through a checkpoint. And then if they didn't recognize the people, they had to say something in the Dutch language that no foreigner can pronounce. And I'll do it here. It is a schiet, schijf, school. The SCH is horrible to pronounce. And it means that it is a, now you would say, where does the police go and train their shooting? It's like a shooting school, where they train people to shoot. But it's called Schiet, Schijf, School. And many of the Germans had, or the German commando had put German people among the Dutch population who were really soldiers in civilian clothes. So they were at strategic points and helped the Germans, settle in Holland. And so, but the Germans, although German and Dutch are both Germanic language, a German could never say the SCH like a real Dutch person. So the soldiers could kind of weed out civilians that went through the checkpoint. I think it was, losing battle in any case, but you know that in retrospect, but not then. And then the third day, it was a losing battle. The airplanes that the Dutch army had were destroyed. The Germans had total, they were supreme. And so their last horrible act was to bomb Rotterdam. And they bombed Rotterdam. The center of Rotterdam was gone. And of course, thousands of people died. And in the evening, my mom took me upstairs where I had a bedroom with doors that opened and a balcony. And she took me to the balcony, and I saw towards the southwest just huge fire. It's impossible how large a fire can be. And so the Germans put their ultimatum to the Dutch government and said, if you don't,
Surrender.
Capitulate, we'll bomb Amsterdam tomorrow. So the Germans capitulated. There was nothing they could do. And so that was the end of the mobilization of a crazy time, and the war started. So at first I said I would just describe the mobilization only, but shall I go on to, yeah, okay. The first few days of the war, everything was, people just didn't know what to do, what to expect. And some Germans were walking around, but not many. And we thought, what's going to happen? And then all of a sudden, here they came on the Dutch roads from Germany across the border. And they still had, with all their modern, their airplanes and their technology, so way ahead of everybody else in Western Europe, they still had horses that pulled cannon and other equipment. And the Germans would march always, and they would sing. And they sang, I have to admit it, they sang beautifully. The Germans just have that. But they marched towards the songs, just the sound of the songs. And all the horses pulling all that heavy equipment. And my mother said, okay, I'm going to make tea. And we all sit in the front room in front of the window, and we have tea, and they can drop dead, and they can sweat, and they can sing, and they can march. But we're here and we're having tea. As if that. But it was, of course, a kind of a resisting act. The only thing she could do. And it also showed us that you stay who you are. And there, as our friend Trump said, vermin. We had all kinds of names for the Germans, but the main name for a German is, we call them a moth, M-O-F, and the plural is moffen. And you never talked about a German, but you always talked about a moth or moffen, and it was usually that a rotten moth, a rot moth. And that is the only resistance you have, certainly as a child. And so they came in, and they of course needed room to establish themselves, and they took schools, first of all, not churches, but schools. And we had 2 soldiers who came to look at our house, counted the bedrooms, asked how many children we had, and wrote it down that there was place for Germans who could live with us, or sleep at least. And the two soldiers who took that survey were just really, really nice, polite. And one was wearing a helmet, and he put it on my head. And because my mother grew up with German parents, I told him in German, "Das ist schwer," heavy. And he was amazed that a little girl could describe what the helmet felt like. And they laughed, they thought it was really great. And I of course felt great because I had communicated with something that was really scary, and it looked as if it was not scary at all. They were just like my brothers. They were nice, smelled, looked nice. And so the Germans came into buildings where the Dutch army used to be, and they parked the horses, and they went to stores where they sold milk and eggs and so on, and they would walk around with half a pound of a package of butter and eat the butter like ice cream, because the butter in Holland was, at that time, was famous, like, you know, now Irish butter is here, is on the top. And so we thought that was really weird, really weird. But that first, I would say 7 or 8 months was kind of not normal, because there were like fleas everywhere. But they were not harmful. And then we lived close to a church, and there was a big, like you would now say, a parking spot, but it was a spot where they still have poles with rings to park their horses, you know, buggies and horses. And we used to play there, but they created a smithy there. And the Germans had requisitioned also horses from the greengrocer, the milkman. These horses were not happy horses, and they needed shoes. And we would sit on a fence, my brothers and I, and watch those German shoe horses that were not very agreeable to begin with. And they would have a horse's hoof between their legs. Of course, the horse would kick. And they would let out a stream of German words that would make a man blush, really. And we would come home and tell my mother at lunch, you know, what we had heard. And she was fluent in German, and she was shocked. Told us, of course, you know, not to, but we had such a good time watching the Germans get kicked. And I thought, you just deserved. There also was a cooking wagon on the farm behind us, and a big chimney smoking. And at one time, the cook had a big fork, went into a great big, what do you call it? In Dutch it is a gamel, you know, it's a huge pan. And he picked up an enormous piece of meat, put it on a board, and started to cut. And I stood there and I thought, oh my God, that smells so good. And he looked at me, he took his fork, and he gave me a piece of meat. I could still taste that piece of meat. It was soft and wonderfully seasoned. It was wonderful. So, in any case, life went on that first year, and it was okay. My dad was called to the nearby town to be asked questions and so on, which when he left we thought, well, we may not see him again, you know. It was uncertain what they were going to do. And that was also at the time when they started to nibble at the Jews. And many of the Jews, of course, tried to get away. Where do you go? In that time, Scandinavian countries were occupied, Belgium, France, occupied. You couldn't go to Germany. All you had was the North Sea. And talking about that, going away, the Dutch Queen Wilhelmina and her family, on the third day of the war, they all packed their bags and left for England. They fled. And as the Queen explained later via the radio from England, she would better govern her country in a free country than under the might of the Germans. There is some truth to that. I still think to this day that a queen or a king doesn't leave his people. But that's my, that's what I would have done. I would not have left. But then I'm not a queen and I don't know. So in any case, the Queen was in England, and then later her daughter, Juliana, was transported to Canada, to Ottawa, where she lived kind of a normal life, because at that, the time when I grew up, royals lived a life that was very stiff and not very nice, not very outgoing, so high, untouchable, really. And Juliana was put in of course, a beautiful house with, at that time, 2 children, and in retrospect, loved her life there because she could expand, she could call on a bike if she wanted to, and go shopping, and I'm sure that she was watched, for security reasons, but she had kind of a free life, and you could see that in the pictures that were taken of her. She was just not a stiff, just young with 2 children, beautiful. And but Queen Wilhelmina stayed in London, where Churchill didn't like her very much because she was very demanding and, asked many questions, and Churchill called her the best dressed man because she was not very feminine. She was small and rather rotund and not dressed nice, very nicely, but big head. I mean, not a lady where you say, oh, what a beautiful queen. So, but what Churchill said, I thought was really like Churchill does, right to the heart of the matter. And so that first year went by, and we got some problems with getting food that we normally would be able to get. And that's the first year that we got coupons, because we were beginning to be rationed, and that was the beginning of the end of a normal life, because we got less and less and less. And in the second year, if we wanted to go to the baker and order a cake, for instance, you had to bring your own butter and your own sugar, and it was weighed and then used in the bakery. In this day and age, can you imagine how filthy that must have been? because not everybody is, clean, and but this was all processed, and I can't remember that any of us was sick because of that. And then, of course, the horrible thing began for the Jews. Jewish children were not allowed to be in what you call Gentile schools, Protestant, Catholic, or neutral schools. They had to have their own schools, and then Jews who were, for instance, professors at universities were fired. Anyone who worked for the government fired. So the Jews became despondent because they could not get food. They were not allowed to enter parks, for instance. It's incredible because they were non-persons. And then it started where they would go to a house of a Jewish family and just told them, pack, you have 15 minutes to pack some things, and we'll send you to Poland, what was called a work camp. And in order to have the Jews, not be afraid, they made it really, there were beautiful camps, so you could garden there, and it was all fine. And of course, they didn't guess that first year yet, but this was, and trains went all the time, and they were put in cattle wagons. It was terrible. My dad had quite a few Jewish clients, and he would go to them on a certain day, and there would be a seal on the front door, and the family was gone. So it was just, it was horrible, because you can't notice that, see that, and keep thinking it's a normal world, of course. And the Germans became more demanding, and you really felt this is not good. And so in the meantime, the Germans, England was at war with Germany, had declared war. And so the Germans started to fly to England. So there were always airplanes in the air from the east towards the west. And they bombed London and environment flat in the Blitz, what was called the Blitz. And these airplanes would, of course, fly over Holland, over France, over Belgium, part of Denmark. And so it was awful, and that kind of stopped after 2.5 years, because then the Germans moved towards Russia, and they needed their planes and their equipment there, because the Russians were fierce. And so the Blitz kind of went down, and in the meantime, England was building up their army, and they had the debacle. Part of the British army went to France to fight the Germans, and they ended up at Dunkirk, where, that was in itself, you could write a book about that, how the troops were moved towards Dunkirk, and here was the North Sea, or the English Channel, and how do you get home? And the English had, whatever boat you had, they went to Dunkirk and picked up soldiers, and it was just a real epic story, and or story, there's a lot of story that happened, and it's a story now, but it was just horrible. But in the meantime, the British had built up their army, got help from America, and got an air force in the end with the help from America. And they started to have first little groups of airplanes to Germany and started bombing strategic industrial points. That became just immense every night. And I had my bedroom at the top floor of the house. And at that time there wasn't much built between the coast and our hometown. And when the wind was our way, I could hear the airplanes coming. And I knew, and I was so afraid that, they lost bombs, they were shot, the Germans said what is that? Is that heavy attack? They had their cannons that shot at the airplanes with lights, and they crossed the light, they would have an airplane, and it was of course shot, they fell down, or they crashed, and it was just every night. It was awful. It was very, very tense. And of all things, because I was the youngest child, I was sent to bed first. So I was all alone in that room, and a flat roof above me, and I thought, oh, one day, a big bomb will fall right on my bed. So I became really very punctual with my blanket, and my sheets had to be just a certain way. My pillow had a certain way, and I would lie there waiting. No way for a child to grow up, no way. But that was the least of it. And in the meantime, we got less and less food, and we started a vegetable garden, and that helped certainly in the summer. But in the winter, the Dutch climate, some summers are very short, so your beans for the winter, the real hard beans and so on, don't really grow. And so we began to feel a shortage of food. And my mom was just a tremendously good cook, and how she did it. But we had food, and we still sat at our table, 10 kids and two parents, beautifully dressed table. You minded your table manners, and this just went on as if nothing had happened. I'm always amazed about that. We all had a serviette with our own serviette ring, and it may make whoever listens to this sick, but we got a clean serviette on Sundays. And at other times, you after dinner you had to fold your serviette like it was, put it in the ring, and it went in a drawer at its sideboard for the next meal. When I think of that now, I think, maybe it would have been a good idea to wash those serviettes in the middle of the week, but that's the way things were then. And we all flourished health-wise. We never got infections because of that or whatever. But it's something that makes you think, because everybody did that. And then my favorite Teun, who in the meantime had gone back, was not in the army, of course, anymore. He went back to university and studied as a civil engineer. And one day he got a summons from the Germans that he had to come to a certain place for instructions from the Germans. And all the career officers from the whole country had to come to a town called The Hague, which was close to us, about 14 kilometers. And the Germans put it in such a way that if you are a career officer and you have your honor, you had to go to this place. And so, of course, when they were all there, all the doors were closed, and they were prisoners of war. And they were put on trains and to Germany, to Brandenburg. And Teun has after the war, some stories about that, because just over the border in Germany, the train stopped. And the prisoners were ordered to get out and go to a big shed where they were probably fed. But after sitting in the train, many had to go to the bathroom. And this was funny because Teun, of course, remembered all that. And the Germans would see one of the officers sit squat, on the rails. And he would say, hop, 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 du domme Dusel, hop, hop, hop. And this became, after the war, we thought this was just hilarious. And so if someone had to do something, we would always say, hop, 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 du domme Dusel. And they also had to, before they left on the train, they had to take off their shoes so they couldn't escape. And they got wooden shoes that were tied together with leather straps. So if they walked, they could only walk tiny little steps. And so all that we heard after the war, and it was then hilarious because the Germans are very, in their language, very big. It's and you have German words that are this long. And the Dutch always made fun of that too. So Teun was a prisoner of war for 3.5 years and was sent from Brandenburg, which is a beautiful place where many people now go for Christkindl market, the market before Christmas. And they were transported to Poland, where it was very cold. And amazingly, because they were officers, so many officers still had a man who would look after their things, whatever that was, because they had nothing but their uniform, because they were supposed to go home after they had to go to The Hague to that meeting. And in any case, we sent packages to Teun via the Red Cross, which he very seldom got, because the Germans took that, or whoever guarded the camp. And I loved Teun. He was my hero, the best person I knew, and I missed him terribly. And so, of course, did my sister, Wil. And she would get maybe a letter once a month, and Teun wrote very, compact in order to write whatever he wanted to. And they found words, certain words, and the letters were all censored. And so Will and he found special words that meant how the war went. So Teun still had an idea of what happened.
Mm.
And it's amazing, which was not caught by the Germans, because it would just say, if Will said, I cooked today and the milk was sour, Germans wouldn't know that there was a message in that sentence, just as an example. But Will was just, really grieving, and the war, everything got worse. The food supply, the bombing, the people that were picked up, who, because the Dutch resistance was then starting, and of course people did stupid things or dangerous things, and they were picked up. And the Germans could come in your house at any time. And then all the men in the age of 16 to 64 had to work for the German war industry. And at first it was a voluntary thing. Men could just go to a center and say, I want to go to Germany. And these people were pretty well fed and housed, but they also worked with people from concentration camps. And the people who went voluntarily were not looked at very friendly by the Dutch population. And but then the Germans needed, people to make weapons, for anything for the war industry. So they started, if you were a young boy and you were on a bike, they stopped you and they picked you up and they sent you off. And so you were, as a young man, you were not safe anywhere. And I had 4 brothers who were in that age. My dad was too old then. No, he wasn't too old, but there was never, I don't know why he wasn't picked up, but he wasn't. But my four brothers had to keep themselves away. And if you can imagine, they were then between 14 and 19. What kind of a life is that? You go to bed and you're not safe, because the Germans can come and raid the house. You cannot go out. 8 o'clock curfew until 6 the next morning. So you were hiding all the time. And I have one brother, Eric, that after we were liberated, and he stepped outside and he walked in the dark to the center of our city, he just felt such an overwhelming sense of relief that he could do that anytime he wanted to. It's amazing. But we went through those first 3 years, besides the misery and the grief about Teun. And then the Germans started to nibble on women, and they said that unattached young women had to go and work for the Germans also. Well, my parents had 2 daughters. They were in the age. And my oldest sister, they would never get, because she was too mean. She was really a force, not an easy person. But here was Will, you know, soft, beautiful, nice, very motherly. So my parents said, why don't you and Teun get married? That's possible by proxy. Here is it called by proxy. In Dutch, they have a very interesting expression for that. You marry with a glove. The glove is empty, so that means that the person you marry isn't there. And so the brother of Teun stood in for Teun, and Will went to the town hall and married by proxy, which was the saddest, most awful thing you can imagine, because I knew how she felt, and the brother of Teun was a very nice enough, but not a man who ever smiled or said anything, bolstering Will or helping Will, comforting. So this was awful. And as an aside, Will got from my parents a bunch of pink carnation as a bouquet. And when they came home from the town hall, my mother put that in a vase that my father got from a client when his business existed 25 years. It's a beautiful vase and an antique. So my mother would put those carnations in a vase with all the pink ribbons hanging from it. Beautiful. And every subsequent year that Teun was in prison and the date of Will's fake wedding came, my mother would buy a bunch of pink carnation because she thought that that would please Will, and Will hated it. To this day, she hated pink carnation, she hated that vase. And years later, when I was in America and I came home in Holland, she brought a vase to me and she said, will you please take this son of a bitch with you, because I can't stand the sight of it. I have it now. And so I think that's rather funny and sad all at the same time. But then she was married, and married women could not go to Germany and work. So she was safe in that respect. So as the war went on, the Dutch resistance, of course, grew. And we at home had two factions. My oldest brother, who was a medical student, was in a group of resistance with people who were younger. My dad was in a group of officers, of reserve officers and older people. The older group was more careful what they did, or the younger group said, go kill them. And they did, which didn't agree with my dad, because he said because they will retaliate. But on the other hand, when you're young, I think if I had been in the resistance and I could have killed a German, I would have done it, because we hated them and what they stood for, what they did. It was just awful. And the only not awful thing is during the war, we had to give one bedroom to a German soldier. And the German soldier came, and he had a big duffel bag that was about that high, and he wasn't much bigger than the duffel bag. And he was such a sweet little man. And my dad told him, my dad, who was the victim, and this German had the upper hand, And my dad told him, you don't come home drunk, you don't make any noise, you don't throw up anywhere, and you stay in your room. And he said, yes, sir. And he crawled up the stairs. Well, my mother, being my mother, felt sorry for him. And in the winter, when it was so cold and no eating, my mother brewed something. We had not real tea anymore, but it was called ersatz tea. You know, they had some leaves from herbs or whatever. And my mother would make a cup of tea for him and crawl upstairs, knock on his door, and here the poor man was sitting. He had gloves that were cut off so he could hold a pen. And he was a farmer from Westphalia. He didn't want to be in the army. He didn't want to be in our house. And he was painstakingly writing a letter to his family. So my mother, you know, she kept bringing him something warm because she felt really sorry for him. And then the next day he would come with a piece of his ration of bread, which was a sourdough, really dark bread, delicious. I can still taste it, and I like to cook, and so food is, I retain tastes, and that bread was just wonderful, and I think it was also wonderful because we didn't have much, and he would say to my mom, that is for the kaninchen, for the rabbits, and we had rabbits that we had to slaughter to have some meat. And talking about the rabbits, there was one rabbit that had dark, kind of hazelnut brown hair, big brown eyes. We all thought she was Jewish, and we called her Sarah. And Sarah was never slaughtered because we loved Sarah. And so one day my dad said, you know, he didn't slaughter the rabbit. His sons had to do it. He said, at the table, you, Tim and Eric, you have to slaughter Sarah for meat for next week. Tim and Eric didn't say anything, and they thought, no way. So Sarah was in a kind of a little garage to the side of the house. And the next morning, they found her cage, the door open, and Sarah was gone. To this day, we don't know if any of us unlatched the cage or if Sarah was stolen, because people did steal like mad, because you have to live. So that's the story of Sarah ending in our family, and everybody loved Sarah. And it's so sad, really, you know, when you think of that. And well, in any case, life went on, and you try to live as normal as you can. My dad's car, in the meantime, was stolen. He got his car, he backed out of the garage. 2 Germans stood there and they said, get out. They got in and the car was gone. Boom, just like that. So my dad then had to visit his clients by tram, by bus, by train. And that was the way it was. But it illustrates that the Germans had the upper hand. At one, that was in the second year, we had to deliver to the Germans at a center all our radios. And of course, you know, when you're in a pickle like that, you're not going to be without a radio. So we gave a very old radio, so we had proof because the Germans, being Germans, they have to, you know, they had to give you something that they could write and stamp. Boom. So we had a sign, we had something that we could show a German if he would come and say, I need your radio. No, we don't have a radio. Here is the proof. And so we built our radio, or my brothers built a radio between a ceiling and a floor of my dad's office in a room. So when we had to listen or wanted to listen to the news, we had to put a rug away and what they say, you know, instead of a wooden floor, there was a floor covering that covered all the floors in the house. And you would lie on your belly and listen to the news. But the Germans were very smart because they would put a sound in the news from England that went like, ooh, 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 ooh. And you really had to listen what was being said. So they distorted the news. But I told my husband that, and he always asked me, how did that go? It was really funny. And so we got the news, and we knew that the war was, in the beginning, was not going to go well. And the German soldiers, when they marched from one point to the other through the streets, and I walked to school, and they walked this way, and I would walk that way, they would sing a song, und wir fahren, und wir fahren, und wir fahren gegen England, England, ahoy, ahoy. And I hated that song, hated it, and as they walked, and I walked against them, depending how the wind was, I could smell them. I could smell uniform wool, metal, and their sour bread. And that's a scent that stays with you all your life. And the sound of the songs is still with me, and I don't like it, but that's the way it is. But it was not, I always, if it was a winter day and there was a heavy mist, a heavy fog, and there's a lot of that in Holland because you're so close to the North Sea, and it's a really thick fog. I couldn't see them, and I felt insulated, and it felt wonderful walking to school like that. So that was in one instance when fog was a good thing. But it was horrible. Then they requisitioned the school that I was going to, and there was a place for nuns. What is it called? Where nuns live?
Monastery?
A convent.
Convent.
And they took the whole thing, and the nuns were out on the street, and there were hardly any pupils anymore, few pupils who lived in the town where I lived. And so the nuns were billeted with people who said, you can come to me or you can come to me. And they started to teach children in those houses where they were, because eventually all the schools were closed. They couldn't be heated, and the Germans had also requisitioned many schools. So everything was abnormal, really abnormal, and very, very tense. And every night at that time, after the 2.5, third year, airplanes started coming from England to Germany. I mean, in droves, every night. And this, I don't know if you can see this painting in the, but my mom would get up in the middle of the night, see if I was asleep, and if I was not, she said, come downstairs, and she would fix me, even if it was hot water, but something warm to kind of placate me. And this painting was hanging over a sideboard, and because of the vibration of the planes, this would go like that, and she would come in and look at that and go bang. And so after my parents died, I said I would like to have that painting. So it's, and planes of course crashed, and they had to release bombs and so on, and it was a really fearful time, a real fearful time. I want to stop it right now.